Well, I'm Micah Redding, and I'm here with Kahlil Corazo and Max Schultz, and we are going to discuss the philosophies of Rene Girard and David Deutsch. Now, these are some interesting ideas. I think I should have had individual conversations with both of you guys. You're both fascinating characters, both exploring great ideas, but you're both exploring this intersection of Deutsch and Girard, which I have not seen anywhere else in the world. So I wanted to jump into this. I got a little excited and wanted to jump in because I'm hoping that we launch a whole new field of study here tonight in exploring the intersection between these things. So just a little bit about you guys. Kahlil, you're from the Philippines. Is this correct?
That's right. I'm calling from the Philippines right now.
Yeah, okay. And you've recently published a book. I would pronounce it Rajah versus Conquistador. And you also write a Substack, Explorations. Any other writing project or anything like that I'm missing?
Well, like recently, I had my first journal article in Contagion. That's like the Rene Girard journal by the Michigan State University. So that's probably
Yeah.
what's
Okay.
like more relevant to this conversation.
Very cool. Yeah. And Max, you write a Substack Mimesis and Infinity, and I think you've recently been working on a new baby. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I've got a 9-week old at home. That's occupying a lot of my time, but I try to write some articles and continue reading as much as I can.
Okay. Well, very cool. I think maybe Kahlil, I might have met you on Twitter a few iterations of social media ago. I think Max, as soon as I found you on Substack, I was very intrigued. So I want to just start with the question: what got you guys interested in Girard and Deutsch? Like, what brought you into those two thinkers specifically? So maybe Kahlil, we'll start with you.
Well, for Girard, my introduction was the book by Luke Burgess, Wanting. So that was my first introduction to Girard, and I just kept on going deeper into that world. And then I actually went into Deutsch because of Girard, because Girard has this. At the time, I was like, it's a strange claim that his theories were scientific, and I realized that I didn't really have a background in like how to understand this. Later on, I discovered that this whole field is called epistemology, and then I started out with Popper, since I realized like my just by absorbing like based on my upbringing, it's like falsifiability was my model for like what is true. And then from Popper, I discovered well, not really discovered, but I I saw that perhaps Deutsch was a better and clearer what you call this entry point towards having a model in which I could understand Girard's claim of being scientific. So that's where, and then just also I guess maybe the reason why I'm like I continue using their ideas is like they just resonated with me. Like Girard resonated with my experience, and his models proved useful in real life. And Deutsch's ideas as well are pretty like it's like they're not just like these nice things to think about, but they're very useful in actually operating in real life. So that's like how I entered this very small club of people who are fascinated with both Girard and Deutsch.
Nice. What about you, Max?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been interested in like progress, like how has the world kind of like gotten to where it is today, and like, like a lot of people these days that feel disillusioned with how things are, trying to understand like, is this abnormally weird right now of like how things are, or have things always kind of been this way? I'm probably more of the latter camp of like the world has always gone through these cycles of like where everyone thinks like the world's about to end any time now, and then it kind of cycles through. But with Girard and Deutsch, I think I'd heard of Girard probably over a decade ago. I mean, I think through like Peter Thiel. I think he's kind of one of the bigger, evangelists of Girard's ideas these days. And I think I'd bought Things Hidden a while ago. I tried to read it, shortly after I got out of college. Realized I could not read it because it was too difficult for me to read at the time. And then so it kind of sat on my shelf for a while, and then I did read Wanting, and that kind of reintroduced me into the Girard ideas like a couple years ago. And then I was reading Beginning of Infinity probably at the beginning of this year. I mean, all those ideas like really resonate with me. Like I think the whole like kind of critical rationalism and like, falsifying ideas, like, there's no such thing as like, like proven science, like, so, or like settled science, things like that. So that's all his ideas really resonated. And as I was going through and kind of getting deeper into his ideas, like in particular, I think the anti-rational memes and kind of like how we got to this sustained, beginning of infinity with the British Enlightenment. And I kind of a light bulb went off in my mind of like, it seemed like there was something kind of related to Girard's ideas and like, Christianity generally as well. So then that kind of led into the whole Substack that I started. And I kind of went a lot deeper into reading. I actually finished all of Things Hidden since then, and started to try to connect those ideas together. And I thought in like a very interesting way that I hadn't seen others doing. And I didn't see Deutsch. Deutsch definitely has like more of a, against religion type of point of view. So it's kind of a weird stance to say that like, oh, like, actually Girard and Christianity actually have a lot to do with, epistemology, which is probably, puts me in a rare camp of like a Christian, like critical rationalist, I think. So
Yeah, that's interesting. One point maybe that comes to mind for me is that earlier in his career, Girard was more critical of traditional religion in its acceptance of the kind of sacrificial reading, this kind of thing. And over time, he kind of reconciled with that. At least that's my understanding. I think, Kahlil, you've actually been writing about this a little bit, I think.
Yes, I went deep into that sort of like two factions of the world of Girardians. And then in the latest volume of Contagion, the last article there is actually about that. So, and then it's very like, it takes a side, and it talks about how Girard in the 80s thought that the sacrifice, the archaic sacrifice, ritual human sacrifice, and the sacrifice of Christ are so different that you should not use the same word for those two phenomenon or events. And then later on, after his conversation with this theologian Schwager, he changed his mind. So this article, the title is provocatively, it says provocatively titled Girard's Apostasy, says that, the atheist Girard was correct. And actually, Peter Thiel mentions this in his conversation with Jordan Peterson. So Thiel is sort of a part of the camp. So I was even wondering, it's like, is Thiel the one behind this? So anyhow, those are like, that's an interesting conversation, which also led me to explore possible answers. Then, I mean, I don't have a background in theology, but I suppose the answer is there. And since like Girard changed his mind after talking to a theologian, and the one who, like, the answer I found convincing, or I felt that resolved this, was the critique of Girard by this theologian named David Bentley Hart. I think it's an Orthodox theologian. And I think it's the best critique of Girard I've seen. He both so he uses Girard's perspective to contrast the world of sacrifice as a solution to disorder in the old Roman world, no? and then contrasting that with the understanding of sacrifice in the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. So I won't do it justice if I try to explain it, but so it's in the book, the the beauty of infinity, or the beauty of the infinite, by David Bentley Hart.
Yeah, yeah, lots to unpack there. So there's a touch point, I think, for this discussion that seems to me that we could talk about progress. Progress has a particular meaning for Deutsch and a interesting kind of intersection with Girard. So I wonder about that. Like, what is progress for these two thinkers, and what is ultimately going on with progress? What is the significance of progress? Why is it a challenge or a problem or something to grapple with?
I can
Probably
take a
mass
first
could be
stab.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. What is progress? Yeah, big question. So I actually I almost think of it like, I think progress is like almost too ambiguous these days. And it's almost like a bad word in some circles. And I actually just like progress almost is like the advancement of these two ideas is almost like how I consider progress. Like, from a Deutsch perspective, like I think it's just inherently good to create more knowledge and like better understand the world. And I think that's largely where kind of Deutsch's philosophy comes from, just like, and probably why he spends so much of his time like on the theory of knowledge. Is just like, it's obviously the thing he cares the most about and like wants to make sure the world kind of continues to solve problems, and like understands that like it's okay that there's going to be more problems, like there's actually an infinity of problems after this problem that we solve, and we should just be okay with that and be excited about like kind of continue to move forward in solving problems. And I think that's like a pretty good way to think about progress, rather than like we're going to land at some utopian endpoint on earth here, and that's going to be the end state. So I think kind of this idea of like this infinite progress, that from a Deutsch perspective, knowledge is really important. And then I think, Deutsch does talk a little bit about, I think, moral knowledge, but I think, Girard kind of takes that much further, in terms of like, how do we see kind of violence continue to like decrease like in our world? And I think you really do have to like go put yourself. I mean, I read Dominion recently, and I think that kind of helped kind of lay the picture of like some of the historical of like what was the world really like, in the ancient world, and like what what was violence back then. Like, I think it's very hard for us to grapple with so many things, kind of, especially for all of us kind of brought up in kind of a Christian culture. There's so many things that we just kind of take for granted, with respect to like the moral arc of like history. Like, that's kind of actually probably just due to Christianity, and like that there is this such thing as a moral arc. And I feel like we've kind of gotten so separated from that with like kind of the secular humanism ideas, and like now with like postmodernism, that's really kind of trying to take down like Christianity and like kind of revert everything back to more of just like everything's power dynamics, and maybe there isn't an objective morality. So there's a lot of like troubling ideas, I think, in kind of like the more secular area right now. And I kind of see Girard as actually laying out a pretty robust case. Like, if you can take your blinders off, if you're like actually like against religion generally, that I think he lays out a pretty logical argument that can speak to people who maybe are in the Deutsch camp, or more in like a critical rationalist type of camp, and more like agnostic or atheist. So that's kind of how I saw them like coming together. I thought Girard kind of lays out an interesting path of like how we can continue to like make sure violence is decreasing in the world. And Christianity hasn't solved that. The way I kind of write about a lot is like it provided this like error correction mechanism, to bring in like a Deutsch term, where like even if the church is doing something wrong, the cross is this like ever living symbol that eventually someone will break, and they'll break off, or like something will happen. And then that's kind of like you see with like the Protestant Reformation and like things like that. So continually like as power tries to even use Christianity to like subject itself over people, it kind of self-corrects. And the way I think about it is like, it's not Christianity's fault that like humans used it incorrectly. Like, that was always going to happen. Like, humans have always like used power to like dominate other people. Like, that's just kind of the status quo. And I think Christianity kind of provided this unique cultural kind of immune system to, when that happens, there tends to be some sort of revolt or reformation or revolution, and that process continues to play out. And that's why we see this like kind of moral arc. And I think Girard kind of lays out kind of his ideas really underpin like why that is so, with the dispelling of the scapegoat mechanism, and you really that inability to like fully like stifle conversation. So I'll pause there since I think it kind of covers a lot, but that's how I almost think continue those two paths is what progress is. Can you continue the moral progress? Can you continue the knowledge progress? That's what progress is to me.
Kahlil, I think, doesn't your book deal with some of these dynamics?
Definitely. The way I would look at progress is through history and through the change of how societies operate. Because my novel takes place 500 years ago. It's a historical novel, so I had to base it on like an actual event, which was the arriving of Magellan and his crew in what is now Cebu, Philippines, and the encounter of the locals with Magellan's with the West essentially. Oh, and then for the local side, since we didn't have our own like chronicler, so Magellan had Antonio Pigafetta. So I used um, anthropology, so it's a society at the time, and I think you could see there the what in a very clear example of progress, which was like before the actual age, the practice of ritual human sacrifice was ubiquitous, like it's everywhere. So everyone's ancestor was like practicing this. Now, so because like it's very few people actually in the Philippines know about like our practice of ritual sacrifice prior to Christianization because no one wants to talk about it. We're so Christian now that it's so disgusting to talk about it. When I was talking when my aunt asked me what I was working on, I told her like I'm studying ritual human sacrifice, and you could just see in her face, that what the hell are you studying? Anyhow, so but that is a clear that's a clear example of progress. Yeah. So a society is operating on scapegoating and actually killing someone in order to preserve peace. Now, Girard gives a very clear model or theory of why that had to be. So that was sort of progress from just chaos of like all these human societies that didn't survive, no, to this solution of having a scapegoat so that there's the cycle of violence ends with the killing of the person who absorbs or the persons who absorb the guilt of the society. And then later on, the actual age was also a sort of an example of progress because there were all these attempts at ending this obviously bad thing, which is killing people. So philosophies and religions, which drastically reduced the practice of ritual human sacrifice. Here in Southeast Asia, we were not we were not affected by the Buddhisms and the Hinduism and even the what you call this Islam that was already in nearby in Malacca in Southeast Asia. It was the encounter with the Hispanic society that radically transformed this one. So because like okay, human sacrifice is now banned, no? And then slavery, that's also a key part of like the society back then. For you to become a ruler, the the business model was that to raid for slaves and then sell them, and then you are the big man in that small society who depends on you. You as like the local psychopath, you're the one who defends them from the other psychopaths. So and then so the encounter with the West uh, was definitely was progress for us. But although now, as you mentioned, Max, about like postmodernism, um, in our case, that's sort of like post-colonial nationalism. So it's very hard for people to like what you call acknowledge the the good side of the West because because the West is our scapegoat in our history. So everything evil is like projected towards the colonizers. So also, like, another thing that Girard gives you is that awareness of like how propaganda works. Propaganda always has a scapegoat. So your epistemology is like you're blinded by your own like the scapegoating, because it's embedded in you, and then like states what you call this take advantage of that to unite people. Anyhow, I think so. That's how I would see progress, like an actual example, and very like no one will dispute that stopping ritual sacrifice is a good thing. It's a clear example of progress.
So it strikes me that Girard and Deutsch actually have a very similar account of history in some ways, at least in terms of these phases. And you've both kind of mentioned this idea that, maybe ancient humanity was a kind of chaotic situation, right? Perhaps a kind of anarchy. And then it moves into this stability, which is achieved at the cost of truth, right? Or at the cost of, put it differently, delusion, right? And it's achieved as you just mentioned, via scapegoating or something like this, which stabilizes the society, but stabilizes it around something that's actually quite toxic. And then there is a further move, which is the unraveling of that process and its replacement with a more dynamic, open-ended process of self-critique and self-challenge and these kinds of things that kind of pull back the blinders, do away with the delusions of the past. And in both of those cases, Girard will say, we moderns who have our the benefit of this post-ritual human sacrifice world, where we've in some ways, not totally, but in some ways, we've moved out of this scapegoating process, but we still have to recognize our scapegoating ancestors as, there are good things about those societies, and that they did achieve this stability, and that they did achieve something that is we can't totally write off. And Deutsch does a similar thing. His account is, there are human societies that grow up in ancient times and probably go down in flames all the time until they figure out some way to create, in Popper's terms, a closed society, which or a static society in Deutsch's term, which stabilizes, but at the cost of progress, at the cost of knowledge, at the cost of gaining truth. And then something happens, and that process begins unraveling. And now we live in the modern world where we do have this dynamic society, a dynamic process of truth, and yet we also can't just totally write off our ancestors, those previous societies, because they did achieve something good. And part of that good is actually still with us, in the form of institutions or things like that have helped us kind of transition. Do you think I'm seeing a legitimate similarity there, or are there some nuances or details that throw that kind of analysis off?
That's pretty spot on, I think, with like how I saw it, because I was reading, Beginning of Infinity. Like, I mean, I instantly saw kind of a very similar mapping, I think, to what you laid out there. And I think one of the things, like, I'll just add on to it that I think gets confusing is like, I think people think, oh, like, okay, like if, Jesus dies on the cross, like that is the unveiling of the scapegoat mechanism. Like, it's gone, like, but like, wait a minute, if you follow Christian history, like, clearly there's a lot of scapegoating that continued to happen. And I think that's like an important point of like, that's why I kind of focus more of like, it is like a cultural system that provides an error correction mechanism in a way that, societies that are more reliant on like hierarchy, and like power control, like kind of with the state, or like scapegoating, those things controlling the society in a way that like they lack that error correction mechanism. I think in a way that Christian cultures, did develop. I think there's a number of factors that kind of resulted in that. So that's why you see things like the Inquisition or like the burning of heretics at the stake, which are like very much like, okay, well, that's obviously scapegoating. So that's kind of the one point I'd add is like, it's almost like kind of what you said, that Christianity created this like perpetual instability almost in the culture. So it's like we actually can't get to stable. Like it's really, I mean, that's kind of why we're always in these cycles of instability is like, even if we do find a scapegoat for some amount of time, and you could argue that like, we're kind of in an unraveling over the last like 30 years, with like, the end of World War II, you kind of have like, okay, communism is your scapegoat, like Soviet Union, like that kind of unravels. And then that kind of shifted to like terrorism. And then now, now we're kind of in this like constant trying to, is it China? And like, we're trying to find like a new scapegoat. And I think that's kind of like what we're seeing, I think is part of like all the increased instability right now. I think it's not about, do we get rid of that stability? It's really like, that instability is what has provided the landscape for the progress that we've created, both from a moral like reduction of violence kind of over time and creating better institutions over time, as well as like the knowledge progress that results in like new technology and things like that from the Deutsch side. So that's like the one thing I'll add is I think like the instability is a feature of like the culture that is important to progress, because like you said, like without that part you actually have stability, you actually have a quasi peace. It's founded on a lie. It's founded on some amount of violence that's channeled into certain people. But yeah, you no longer have that progress. And there's a lot of injustice still in that world that has no chance of getting better. There's like no knowledge that you continue to create. So I think that's like the one point I'd add about the instability.
Yeah, I don't know if I remember correctly, but I think Deutsch was really just like contrasting static and dynamic societies. And it was Girard who sort of like had this insight that like even the static societies in Deutschen terms, I mean, it was an improvement from just like those societies that didn't survive. We don't even have a name for them because we didn't see them. And I want to say, yeah, it will come back to me. I will add a thought about that. Now let's continue. Yeah.
Well, so I do see these like very similar sorts of ways of constructing the history of the world, and thus kind of like philosophically how you think about the world. And another one that is, well, I guess one of the questions, Girard has an answer to how you get these static or closed societies, right? You do the scapegoating, and it just naturally arises. And his account of that is very compelling to me, or it's convincing that, when you can see the scapegoating thing happen if you work in an office or work with other people. Somebody leaves the company, all of a sudden you got a week or two where all the problems are that person's fault because they left, and they were the source of those problems. And now that they're gone, we're all going to be good. And everybody gets the chance to basically offload all their debt of guilt or, things they need to own up to, mistakes they've made, onto this scapegoat. But the thing is, when you conspire to do that, the thing you can't ever do is go back. You can't ever say, well, wait a second, did we actually wrongly, like, no, you've entered a conspiracy to blame this one person. You can't ever unroll it. And because of that, it always has to grow. Like if you revisit it, it has to grow in the telling. And this person has to become, over time, some kind of mythical monster that was destroying, sucking all the goodness out of the world. And the reason we don't end up with too many of those in office work or whatever is just because our problems aren't that big. But when you deal with society at large, your problems get much bigger, and that scapegoat has to get much more turned into a monster, turned into this monstrous force that just eats the cosmos. But I don't know, Deutsch's answer to like how societies become static is it's I'm not sure it's as complete. He says it's anti-rational memes that basically shut down the means of error correction. They lock a society into a particular mode of operation that works for a while, but then they lack the ability to grow or progress when situations change. I don't know. Do you think that Deutsch's account of that is sufficient, or is he leaving a lot to be explained in what's happening with those societies?
Yeah. Here's what I wanted to say actually, and it's connected to this to answer that. Is that I think Girard's theory is also a theory of like human nature, human instinct. So I think, which is I think not modifiable in a short term. It maybe will take hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Like, how do you change human instinct? And that instinct was built through like also hundreds of thousands of years of like like selecting those societies which found the scapegoat mechanism. So it's embedded in our natures, in our DNA, perhaps. And then, so the solution, I think this is also how Deutsch frames it. The solution was actually cultural, meaning these are like memes that we pass on across generations, not through genes, not through instinct, but through culture, through institutions, through stories, through like essentially how beliefs are transmitted. So those static uh, societies, I don't think Deutsch really cares about how they are built, because it seems his focus really was like what's the future. He just uses them as like, okay, this is the bad state. We found a good state, which is this dynamic society. Um, and also now that the scapegoat mechanism has been revealed, no? And it's I think it's also it's not simply what you call this, like people are already aware of it. The reason is also like it no longer, I mean, we no longer kill kings, we no longer kill like the scapegoats in offices, because also we're Christian. No? There's this there's this nice book about the Philippine Revolution called Passion and Revolution, and it talks about how the Philippine Revolution used the Christian story to see itself as the victim of colonialism. So meaning the Christian story, because everyone knows it now, it could be reused again and again to like whoever, like it's me or like even the worker. If you're a Christian, you cannot help but think, hey, maybe this is like this person is like Christ. We're like heaping this like guilt onto this person. So maybe there's also one like the upbringing as a Christian that we undergo is like the what's called neutralizes the instinct of scapegoating. So I think that's how I would see the like the the forces in society, instinct versus culture, and culture which has become dynamic through Christianity's like always like questioning the motives of the powers that be. That hey, you're not really.
Mhm.
Are you telling the truth? So this truth will set you free. Like truth at all costs. I mean, this is the escape from that old world where power was just like the one dominating.
Hmm. That reminds me. I was talking today about some of that kind of dynamic, of how these things turn back around. So you talked about the people who are evangelized, basically saying, "Okay, I'm like Christ, and you're like my crucifiers," this kind of thing. That turnaround and this kind of ironic or paradoxical thing, I think, is what Max was saying earlier about this self-correcting kind of mechanism. The thing I was talking about was with Galileo and similar stories, right? Originally, this is a story that gets floated by Protestants who are pointing out the errors of the Catholic Church, right? So look how bad the Pope is because he's oppressing scientists. Well, it quickly becomes a story for secular materialists to use to criticize the Protestants for being, part of the church, right? And that just keeps turning. There's a similar thing where the Protestants. I was talking to historian Dale Allison a month or two ago, and he was talking about how the field of this kind of skeptical analysis of miracle claims starts with the Protestants because they're critiquing the Catholic miracle claims. But now it's turned back on them to critique like the whole Christian enterprise. And so there's something there where you cannot seemingly in our culture or our religious tradition raise a critique that doesn't come back on you and offer itself as a critique of what you're doing. And so I wonder if, in this contrast between static societies and dynamic societies, I wonder if we could think of these static societies as being defined by static religions, and then our modern society as having been shaped by a dynamic religion. Kahlil, you mentioned the axial age, so maybe you see it as a broader transition there. But I see that in Christianity, at least, there is this kind of self-critiquing aspect. I don't know. What do you think?
So, so I think Deutsch was correct in saying that they found an answer that worked, and it wasn't like a what you call it, a conscious answer. It's like, okay, bad things happen in this world. We're now surviving. Let's just continue what we're doing without any like model, without any good explanation. So, but once you've hit a point where like it's like like prioritizing truth, like models of the world which are what you call this, which are replicable or which could predict things. I think that opens up the playing field. No, it's like you're no longer bound by a rule-based operating system. You know how this universe actually operates. So in theory, if evolution is correct, societies which have operate on this more freer model based on understanding of this universe rather than just rules that seem to work, would succeed, or would overcome or would defeat those societies which are just have one playbook. So I think that's it. It's really just it's a better understanding of the world. No, so this static is like just having a practice which works versus actually understanding how the world works. That's how I would understand that.
Any thoughts, Max?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that are kind of popping into my head as we're kind of talking about the progress piece, and maybe I'm taking it on a slightly different route. Was just like, but we should talk about, I think I make the case that I think, the Christian culture is a essential component of Deutsch's beginning of infinity, which I don't know if he would agree with. He'd maybe agree that like aspects of that culture were fine, but like, why do we still need the institution or the religion even at this point? Like, we got the good explanations from it. Like, let's just keep on with progress. And I don't know exactly what his position would be, but it might be something like that. And that's where I kind of think like maybe that's not right. And that would put your beginning of infinity at risk here. Is like, do we throw out the baby with the bathwater here by just saying, okay, like, we got the ideas like universal human dignity, like human rights, like all these things. We've got the moral arc. Let's just extract the principles, and like we don't need all the baggage of like the last 2,000 years of Christianity. We can move on. I think that's kind of somewhat of the position, and I think where I struggle with that is like, I mean, we see a lot of the examples today of like increased power dynamics. Like there's just at very high levels of our society, we see kind of scapegoating coming back, and like there being less of like an anchor actually into like, universal human dignity. There seems to be much more of like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys going on. And it's like, we can kill these bad guys because these are the good guys. And like, that to me just sounds like, okay, well, are we coming back to like that ancient scapegoating mechanism in a way when you get into this thing, it's like, it's all power dynamics, and, there's an oppressed group and an oppressing group. And we need to be, on the side of the oppressed, which like that sounds like the Christian idea actually in a way. I mean, in a way, Jesus came to do just that, right? He came to like relieve the victims from being oppressed by the power. But I see like, oh, maybe we're losing something with the side of mercy, with forgiveness, with how do you resolve that conflict and like move forward as a society. And it's like, I don't see those ideas as strongly tied in with like the more secular kind of humanism project, than I think they should be. And I actually think as you start to say, okay, how do we fix that project? It starts to just look a lot like, church doctrine as you go read it right now. Like they kind of have thought about these principles. They've been working on them for, 2000 years. So that's kind of how I started my project. I was like, I think, how do I get more people that were kind of in my camp, that maybe were raised Christian, kind of left that, kind of became maybe agnostic or atheist, and then, we're kind of thinking like something's off in the world, like, but how do we like continue on? And it's like, I'm not necessarily sure it's something completely new. There's actually, I think, a lot that's already there for us to uncover. So, yeah, I'll pause there. I mean, that's kind of like one thought I was having on that as you guys were talking.
Yeah, I
So,
think sorry.
No, go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah, I think the challenge with Deutsch, or the Deutschen model, is actually the mimetic what you call this, expansion. Because if you look at history, what actually ended ritual human sacrifice and slavery was not better philosophies. It was a better story. So, and it was the story of Jesus Christ, this God man who died on the cross. Whether you believe it or not, it's clear that the story affected history. No? So, and I don't know if you could do that same thing with mere good explanations. No? So this is the playing field. This is what you have to work with: human nature and how people communicate and absorb ideas. It seems really story is what works. And the story of like the scapegoat, I mean, the archaic story that the witch is evil, the Jews are evil, there's like, and or we are different, our caste is different from the slaves. So these are all stories which were defeated not by an explanation, but an actual story of God becoming man, dying on the cross for us, and he was innocent, and yet we killed him. So that was the powerful countervailing force against the powerful story as well, the scapegoat. So I think that's where Deutsch's good explanation would find a challenge. Like, how do you actually transmit that, given human nature and looking at the evidence of history, that it's story that really succeeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Girard has a quote. He says, "We did not stop burning witches because we discovered the scientific method. We discovered the scientific method because we stopped burning witches." And his idea there is that it's this moral transformation that starts from that narrative that then opens up the possibility of these realizations of truth, right? And so in some very concrete ways, Girard thinks you can basically see that the the witch is not really a witch once you actually have this kind of realization. But then that launches everything else, right? So truth, your ability to perceive the truth, to cut through this kind of self-delusion that you have to encase yourself in as a static scapegoating society, that comes from that encounter with the Christ story. What's interesting about that, you could say, as Max, you were alluding to, and I think a lot of people say, something along the lines of Christianity gave us these ideas. Deutsch has actually said something along the lines of, the scientific revolution was like a mutation of Christian ideas. So these ideas were there, they weren't quite right, they mutated, and then we got the scientific revolution. So I think he would recognize the historical contingency. But then I think he would say, but yeah, we don't need the religious part of it. We just need the core kind of philosophical ideas. But I think both Girard and Deutsch actually recognize that the project is not over. In Deutsch's terms, we live in a world that's still primarily controlled and defined by what he calls anti-rational memes that create self-delusion, that lock us into static behaviors, remnants of static societies, this kind of thing. In Girard's terms, we're still scapegoating. We just have gotten a ray of light, right? And Girard thinks we need to keep getting that ray of light, keep going back to the mass or to church or to the story or whatever, so that we continue to kind of peel back the scapegoating habits from ourselves. And Deutsch thinks we have to keep critiquing these anti-rational memes in our heads. But I kind of think that Deutsch has not wrestled with the actual difficulty of unpacking that, of unraveling those behaviors from yourself. And so that's where I would go with, I think what you're saying, Max, is I don't know if you can keep this dynamic society running, progressing in this way, if you don't keep kind of anchoring it in that realization, which comes from, or at least did come from, the Christ narrative.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, because we've talked a lot about scapegoating, but we haven't talked about mimetic desire as much. But that kind of goes to what you're saying of we still have all these anti-rational memes, and why do we still keep ending up in scapegoating? And I do think that that's where you start to get back to some Christian ideas around sin, and the idea of we all kind of start from this original sin, and there's the fall, and it's something we kind of have to continue to work on forever. You can never you'll never get there, but you always have to keep working to be better. And I think Girard kind of talks about that as well. With respect to all the examples he talks about from the Bible of where they're really talking about mimetic desire of these rivalries that are resulting in that violence. And I think kind of remembering that there is this inherent violence in humans, and we kind of come, we're kind of evolved from it, for whatever those reasons are. Girard lays out kind of those reasons in mimetic desire, and that's something of just kind of how societies came about. I believe in things, and they kind of talk about you can imagine as the early hominids are kind of evolving, you end up in these all out war scenarios because two people want something, and then all of a sudden everyone's fighting. That channels into the scapegoat. But you can see violence probably had to evolve that way, because who were the societies that were going to survive, for tens of thousands of years? You're going to have societies that are maximally good at internal peace and maximally good at external violence. So there is something there that I think we shouldn't lose sight of, and that it's still something deep in all of us and in the society generally. So how do you reckon with that? I don't see any I don't really see a modernist idea around how do we self-reflect on that, and how do you do it at a societal level. I think our best examples are actually in the religious sphere of how they have embedded those ideas across cultures. Right now we have I think it's fair to say some of the values of universal human dignity. I think a lot of people do believe that. I think there's very few people that kind of walk around with the Nietzschean set of values today, at least in the West, right? So those are probably fine, and those probably carry on. But there are some of the practices, I think, that religious cultures had, that I do think we're kind of losing, as people don't go to church anymore, or they kind of walk away from that. And you think you can just carry the good values, but it seems we're missing something with the practice part of it. And I think there's one other point I want to just kind of throw in there on that is I wrote a couple articles because I read a book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, and that covers lays out this analogy pretty much of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere being very analytical, controlling, grasping, and the right hemisphere being more, anchored to reality, but like much more, open to receiving, comfortable with ambiguity, paradox, like whereas left hemisphere is like trying to put everything into categories and kind of control everything. And he makes this argument like we've kind of gone cycles of like being more left hemisphere and right hemisphere over the last couple thousand years. And right now he sees us going kind of way far into left hemisphere world. And that means that we're getting kind of further and further unanchored from like, truth and reality. And these left hemisphere kind of like for the sake of like continuing abstraction, like can kind of dilute itself of like what's really true. And I think there's something kind of there is like we've kind of continued to chase reason further and further and kind of push away kind of the spiritual and like the transcendent, that like part of that is also like how we're leaving the right hemisphere kind of behind, right now. And I think if you go even in like the religious world, and one of the things I'm kind of digging into right now um, is like Vatican II, which is when the Catholic Church they kind of drastically changed a lot. Like was simplified. They changed the mass structure kind of in the 60s, and I've been looking into like what they had like the traditional Latin mass before that, where like the priest actually like faces the altar. You can't actually really hear what he's saying. It's all in Latin, so no one really understands what's going on. There's hymns, there's incense, and all this stuff. It was a very spiritual like. It feels very foreign to like I think today's world. Like, what, that doesn't make any sense. Like, how am I supposed to learn or get anything out of this experience? And I think so. I see something there, and kind of that aspect as well. Is like if you just continue to go to reason, just continue to try to abstract principles, that we're probably missing something that kind of lines up with that right hemisphere, that comfortable with mystery, comfortability with like paradox. That I think your religion has grappled with over. I mean, they've got the length of 2,000 years, in Christianity, where they've grappled with these things and kind of evolved through those different eras. And I think that's one thing I see kind of missing right now is like we don't really know how to grapple with that. And that's why I worry of like, okay, just you leave it all aside now. We might really actually leave something out that's very important to what stabilized our, or set our society's culture right now. And do we fall back into something where it's like there's more and more violence, and then we fall into actually like a more totalitarian kind of government, because that's what we don't know. We just want peace, so we decide we want the powerful ruler, and like we'll subject people and we'll scapegoat people to kind of create the peace. So that's kind of where my fear comes, and then you start to get increased anti-rational memes and like all the progress that we talked about kind of in. So I'm not saying like you can't, like maybe you can kind of leave the baggage of Christianity behind and kind of try to abstract the ideas, but like to me it just kind of feels off that we're not in a place where we really can. And then you have such like a rapid change from like just the last few generations of like where like everyone in the United States is like pretty much Christian, large amounts of people go to mass, like now like huge percentage of people like consider themselves nuns, NONES, not NUNES. And that's kind of like what happens in a few more generations when, right now, at least all of the people who like say they're atheist or agnostic, they were probably raised Christian and their parents were Christian, even if they stopped going to church and everything. But what happens like in 3 more generations with like now you have 3 generations of agnostics who continue to raise more agnostics, and now it's really far into the past. Like, do we just fall into kind of what is maybe the more of our default, which is maybe the pre-Christianity world, and we kind of just fall back into like that as our culture? And that might mean like in order to have peace, you have to have more hierarchy, more control, more scapegoating that has to be put in place to kind of maintain the society and keep stability. And then you kind of lose your beginning infinity and all the progress. So I'll pause there.
Do you have some thoughts on that, Kahlil?
Yeah, just you mentioned, Max, that you sort of don't have a current solution, but I think the solution right now, or the past maybe a few hundred years, has been the nation state. I mean, it's essentially we've like decided that, or history has ended up like with what you call this, like the monopoly of violence into the nation state.
Mhm.
And it's still an ongoing experiment. It does sort of work. There's definitely less like localized violence, but you have like this like violence at the nation state level. And we've undergone those world wars, which could have eliminated humanity and might still happen in the future. So I think that's the current solution right now for like this piece. So I don't know what's the actual better solution in the future, but it's like the one reason I like Deutsch is because it's an optimist. We can figure out these things. We will make mistakes, but what was his like mantra, like There will be always be problems, but like you'll also look for solutions as well, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think yeah, I agree like on the nation state piece, but like I mean still you're dealing with nation states from the West that are still largely anchored to the Christian ideas and values, and you do see further erosion of those. But I think the progress piece, though, to count, this is like almost the counter to what I'm saying that people would say, but it's also the kind of the counter to Deutsch's thing of his optimism is like we've seen cultures that have had hundreds of years of progress. I mean, people talk about the Islamic Golden Age. They obviously had significant progress in China for like hundreds of years at various points. They I believe had the printing press hundreds of years before Europe had the printing press. But something happened in those societies where it stopped. you know and I think that from the Deutsch side, that'd be like some sort of anti-rational memes had to have eventually been able to suppress the progress. And you also had that happen in the West itself, right? I mean, we've talked about Galileo and like the Catholic Church trying to suppress ideas, but like it didn't work. So like there's something, and maybe obviously it's a very small sample size, so we kind of live in the world of this is kind of a philosophical discussion. You can't totally get to like certainty, but there is something there of like, okay, these other cultures that had these like multi-centuries of like progress and then they stopped, that doesn't mean ours can't stop as well. And I think we should just be very careful of like what underpinned our culture for so long, before completely throwing it out, because I would think the default is closer to the Nietzschean like pre-Christian world where it is a will to power. There is no such thing as objective morality, and the powerful should win, and that's what's good. And we kind of see that happening. I mean, you look at our politics in the U.S. right now. I mean, it definitely feels like it's very much like getting further and further untethered from some of the ideas, in a way that I don't think they were. Like you look back 150 years ago in the U.S., like presidents were very much like Christian back then, and they believed in those. They believed like they deeply held those values in a way that I'm not sure I see as much of today, kind of in the power-driven world. So that's kind of like the cautionary tale of like, progress has stopped. It's gone on for hundreds of years in different points, and it has stopped. So like we do need to deeply understand like what about our culture helped us get to that beginning of infinity point, and make sure that we can sustain it. So yeah.
Speaking from the optimist side, I think we could ask even the question of, well, could we radically increase the amount of progress that we were experiencing, right? That's the kind of question that Deutsch, I think, would challenge us or kind of inspire us to ask. And so then that makes me want to go back and see, well, what did start the current path of progress we're on? What were the conditions? What were the initiating elements? That kind of thing. What further realizations or organization or whatever were needed to actually kind of start that process going faster than it had before? I think both of you mentioned, Kahlil, you were talking about, well, it was a story that actually changed things. And Max, you're talking about this left brain, right brain situation. So I think actually Deutsch and Girard both have a sort of idea about that. So Deutsch talks about inexplicit ideas. So it's not just the explicit propositional ideas that matter, but it's actually all explicit propositional ideas are anchored in these inexplicit ideas that are actually the majority of what we ever think and feel and operate on. And so I think that does get to something deeper. It's something more fundamental than propositions that is needed to actually create the progress. And Deutsch talks about institutions and traditions in this way, right? The institutions of parliament that allow it to operate. He says we don't even know fully why it works. we see a system, but we don't understand why it's stable or why it works in precisely this way, that kind of thing. And Girard too, he wants to, I think, even in his more critical phase, still wants to say something about you need to go to church. You need to experience this story and let it critique you. You need to in some way encounter this to continue that process of unraveling and opening up new kind of revelations or new insights or a new kind of potential for progress, that kind of thing. I don't know. There's a lot here. Do you think in general, are you guys optimistic about the future or pessimistic?
Optimistic. I think like the fact that we all can sit and have a conversation like this is kind of what makes me optimistic. Clearly our ideas aren't being suppressed. And it is actually pretty hard to suppress ideas, I think, in today's world. And something about that, makes me think that people will continue to band together to kind of like create that progress. And as long as like conversations continue to happen, and I think we'll land on the right ideas and the right explanations to continue forward. But I don't think it's you shouldn't be, I think, like irrationally optimistic. I think it's something that has to be fought for, by us in the present, of like how do we sustain these things, like what's important, and like make sure we each kind of do our part, kind of on the individual level of not scapegoating people yourself, kind of calling it out when you do see it, and thinking about those things, and then kind of pushing for the right ideas kind of out there in the world. So yeah, I'd say I'm an optimist for that, but a rational one.
Yeah, for me, I've sort of like accepted my powerlessness in terms of like moving history and like solving this world problems. Like my interest in Deutsch and Girard are really more individual. And in that case, I'm very optimistic that, you could live a good life, you could influence the people around you. And I think Girard as well was talking about this in one of his last books, Conversion and Evolution. So part of that book was really about like this phenomenon of conversion, and he was talking about his own conversion. And I think this is really like this is how progress is made. It's never going to be like this societal level, being individual free persons. So each one needs to like convert. It's like you change your mind into a better model, into a better, like you have to become a dynamic person yourself. No, you couldn't play with just like surviving by obeying rules you think is how the world should be. But what is the word? What is the true? What is the truth? What is the truth about this world? And part of that is the innocence of other persons, and realizing also the truth that you have this tendency to scapegoat. So I think that's it. That's conversion is like the optimist way of moving forward.
I like it. I like it. The open society of your own personal mind. That's the dynamic optimism that needs to happen. So we are over an hour. I definitely want to keep going with this conversation. I think what you guys are writing is really interesting and compelling stuff. And so anyway, I think this is great. I'm going to put links to the Substacks. I'm going to put links to the books we've talked about. I'm also going to pitch a book for people who are new to Girard. If you have any kind of awareness of the Bible or Christian thinking, I think I See Satan Fall Like Lightning is a really great book to start with. It's not very long. I'm trying to lead some guys from my church through a book study of this right now, and it really gets into some of his interesting ideas. in a really, I guess, maybe provocative and challenging way really quickly. So that's where I would start if you have any kind of exposure to the Christian world. Max, any last thoughts or recommendations?
I'll second your recommendation. I think don't start with things hidden since the foundation of the world. If you're just trying to get intro to Girard, it's worth it. But I think starting with Icy Symbolic Lightning will lay the foundation to get into that book in a deeper way. No, I don't think I have anything else. This has been a great conversation. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you too. I've loved this, and so we'll have to do more like this. But yeah, we'll hopefully talk again to both of you soon.
Sounds good.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe so that we can keep this going. And please like and share so that others like you can discover conversations like this. Thanks so much for listening.